to tell the story about Hentley Farm, I'm going to go back right to the start. And so the Hentschke family with a T, often sometimes get confused with the Hentschke family without a T. But our family came to the Barossa in 1842, so we're the first of 26 families to settle the Barossa Valley. And they shortly afterwards moved to the western side of the Barossa, and that's interesting where the beautiful red soils are. And somewhere in the 1880s, my family left the Barossa Valley, foolishly, don't understand why. They left the Barossa Valley and went about 2 hours to the east. And there was a broadacre farming community, and I was therefore born on a farm of 25,000 acres, and it didn't rain very much. And after a while, my father and my uncle had a crazy idea to plant a vineyard. And they planted a vineyard, said, there was no other vineyard for nearly 100 miles. And after a few years, my dad was running it. I helped to plant it, but after my dad was running it, and he came to me and he said, Keith, can you please run the vineyard? I said, Dad, I'm 15. I wouldn't know what I'm doing. He said, well, have a look at what I've been doing. It's been a terrible job. So he couldn't be any worse than me. So that was my first start in the viticultural winemaking industry, and it was my job for a few years. And so when I had the opportunity, not long after that, to go to university, of course I chose to study agricultural science, which was hence the understanding soils and how to grow plants, and I also studied wine marketing at the same time, so you can tell I had an interest at a very young age to get into the industry. So now we're talking in the 1980s, and by early 1990 there was quite a few jobs in the wine industry, and I started working for Pernod Ricard, the guys who made Jacob's Creek. And I was here in the Barossa Valley, and I became more familiar with Barossa Valley wines, and I love Barossa Valley wines. I just love their structure, their richness, the completeness of the wines, and of course a wonderful heritage. And I wanted to find my own vineyard. I think one of the things that really also intrigued me, because that was the roots of the Hentschke family. We'd settled here. This was like coming back to home. And by asking my friends, I had a simple question to my friends, and most of them were winemakers or viticulturists. I said, where in the Barossa Valley are the highest quality red grapes grown to make the highest quality wine? It seems a simple question, but it really, I'm not sure how many times it'd been asked. And quite many of them said, Keith, go to the northwest part of the Barossa Valley. Unbeknown to most people, there's beautiful red-brown earth over limestone. There are terroirs soils. And the quality of grapes we're getting from that area is absolutely phenomenal. Well, that was enough for me to then go and get a bunch of wines and do some wine tasting blind with my friends from different terroirs all over the Barossa, and we tasted the wines. And lo and behold, we unveiled the wines, and the wines from this area around Granite Creek were right at the top of the pinnacle of the selection. So that was enough for me, right? And it had the deeper meaning for me too, because it was in the western part of the Barossa where my ancestors had come from. And so once again, it was very much coming home. So I went on a journey. I went on a quest to find a property that had those soils. And one day I was rummaging around the local library. Lo and behold, I found a book which showed me the different soil types of the Barossa done in the 1950s. And I thought, wow, how easy is this, right? So I found the map, and I then started driving around where all the soil types were, this red brown earth over limestone, and just looked at different sites and which represented something which I feel could turn into a vineyard. At the same time, there were other properties on the market, and I reflect back that we looked at them, and some had established vines, some didn't. And I looked at them and said, I remember saying to my wife Ali, no, these don't have the perfect soils. We're just going to walk away from this opportunity. So we really held fast of hell bent on finding the exact right terroir. So one day in my travels, when I said, right, I've found the exact right property, I've found the prior owners, and worked out who they were, I went and knocked on their door and said, introduced myself, and foolishly, a lady came out to speak to me, and foolishly I asked to speak to her husband. It wasn't the smartest thing I did in my life, because unfortunately he just passed away. But she said to me, she said, I don't know what to do with the property because it's too big. It was a mixed farm at the time. We had actually cows were eating the old vines, and you didn't have to be too clever to work out that wasn't ideal, right? So it'd run to ruin, but it was too much for her. So we managed to work out how to buy this exact property from her. I was quite fascinated in agricultural science, and that was important to me, and so we very much took a scientific approach. So the nearest opportunity, I got some consultants involved who were more experienced than me, though I had the education, I didn't necessarily have the experience. And so I worked with actually up to 3 different viticulturists at the time. And the lead viticulturist very much worked with me the concept of soil mapping the whole property. So we dug lots of holes. And what the philosophy was, we were trying to get homogeneous soil types, but then as much variation between the different soil types as we could find, and we're going to design the blocks, the vineyard blocks appropriately. And that's what we did. So that was a bit early in the time. So now we're talking, the property we purchased was in 1997. We did the most of the soil mapping in 1998, all for preparation of planting in 1999. We did the most of our planting. After we planted, and bear in mind, we were a tiny winery at the time. In fact, early on, we were tiny. The vineyard was reasonable size. So the vineyard was bigger than what our small winery was when we started producing grapes. Our first vintage was 2002. So we started selling XX grapes off. That was the only way for us to make ends meet. And with the plan, one day we would consume all those grapes for our own wine brand. And how it started was we'd already started taking grapes from what we call a block called D2. So we named the blocks alphabetically, and D1, D2, D3, and we just happened to chose D2 to make Hentley Farm Shiraz, which is our first wine. In fact, the first year in 2002 we made 2 wines, Hentley Farm Shiraz and Zinfandel. Now Zinfandel has its own story. I'd had some. The reason we planted Zinfandel was I was worried that there was one point in Barossa's history that no one was going to drink Barossa Shiraz again, and that would be a disaster, so I thought I need another variety. So I'd had some Zinfandel, some from California, and I said, gee, I really like Zinfandel, but sometimes the examples I've seen, they were quite alcoholic, and I'd taste alcohol, there'd be a pause in the palate, and then I'd taste the wine. I thought, well, what if I could make the vine struggle and devigorate, and whether we could get flavour at lower alcohol, and whether that would produce a better wine. So there's a part of the vineyard that one of the viticulturist consultants said, Keith, don't plant anything here. It does not have enough soil to grow vines. And I treated that information with a little bit of disdain and said, thank you very much for letting me know that. And then I went ahead and planted Zinfandel. And really trying to get the smaller berries to get the flavour of low alcohol, and that works a treat. So we make a straight 100% Zinfandel, and it's only moderate alcohol, and the planning worked perfectly well. Wind the clock back. So from those the first vintage 2002, we then started walking around. When I say walking is not the right word. We started sampling different grapes and doing some smaller batches from around the vineyard. The Beast came a little bit easier though, because from the same block that we'd taken Hentley Farm Shiraz from, come the 2003 vintage, it created a wine which was rich flavoured, beautiful complexity, strong tannins, but soft grippy tannins. And we said, wow, this is different to the prior year. if this is what we have now in the future, this is the second crop from this vine. If this is what we have in the future, wow, we've got something special here. And I was with another winemaker at the time, and I remember that night going, wow, that's just a beast of a wine. That's how the Beast came about. It was just tasting a wine that tasted beastly. And so in 2003 was our first vintage of the Beast. Interesting enough, when we got a little bit excited, we sent that wine to Robert Parker. He was just showing some interest in our area, and we opened the book after that. The first year we showed, he said, "I'm giving you 95 plus points," and so we're pretty. We said, "Hey, I think we're onto something here." As in, these vines are on their second crop; they're not even near full yield. They were just baby wine vines, and it's like, "Hey, we've got some wonderful terroir." The year after that was when we were selling our wine to grapes to another winery, and they wanted a meeting to discuss pricing, and I knew it wasn't going to be good, and they decided to reduce the price they're paying the grapes for from $2,000 a tonne to $600 a tonne, and that was a bit of a bitter pill to swallow. And it was that point I said, you can tear the contract out, never, don't really want to speak to you again, we'll just take the grapes in for ourselves. And so it was somewhat a surprise when we took those grapes in that we discovered this really soft, elegant, complex wine. It was really cool clonal wine. This had come from our B block, which is down by the creek, and we discovered this cold air pocket settles down in this area and just means that the vines ripen more slowly. They're more of a cool climate expression within the one vineyard. And so this is how we started to create then this wine called the Beauty, because we'd already had the Beast. We said, let's create a wine then that showed the vast variation in terroir between two different sites. The Beauty Shiraz and the Beast Shiraz are exactly the same clone. They're almost treated the same, but we do accentuate the Beauty with a little bit of Viognier wet skins at about 3%, just enough that you can't detect it's actually Viognier, but it adds some really aromatic uplift and some nice soft palate. So that's probably as good an example we have of variation terroir only about 600 feet apart, these vines. But there are all sorts of other examples on our vineyard where we can show you different wines which really speak their own story of terroir, from the Beauty and the Beast we talked about, from the Zinfandel we planted really on rocks in those soils. We make a wine called Von Casper, which is a straight Cabernet Sauvignon, which is only planted 150 feet away from the Beauty block, and it's a classic Cabernet that I think that if we lined it up in front of some great Napa Valley Cabernets, you might be confused, it's not one of them. It's rich and it's tense, but it's got beautiful Cabernet flavours. Well, it's of course planted where the soils are deeper, and that cold air pocket plays a role for that to retain that classic Cabernet flavour. We have a wine further up the hill which we call Clonal Shiraz. 100% Shiraz, planted on a block of about 8 acres in size. And the vines struggle because the limestone beneath the soil is a little bit deeper, so there's a lot more tight clay before it gets to the limestone. And these struggling vines are tiny, produce small berries, but produces most vibrant, voluptuous flavour. Has this amazing footprint. And we have some clonal variations here. So these are off what we call old clones. So the agricultural scientists back in the 1950s decided to propagate high yielding clones, and the ones that were left behind were the low yielding clones. And so we have a lot of these in the Barossa Valley, and we're fortunate that an old German guy called Otto, before my time, had planted these old clones, and these super low yielding, just an amazing footprint. We then go on a journey. We do a blend also from the property called Coast to Hentley, which is only a recent release. And it is the best of the best, only made in the best of vintages. We produce the best barrels, and we use the best of Grenache, Cabernet and Shiraz, but mostly Shiraz in the blend, to create a wonderful wine that you probably just unlike you'd expect from anywhere in Australia. It's got the best, the best of the best. And of course, we love Grenache in this neck of the woods. And we have, Australia, Barossa has some of the oldest vines in the world. And our Grenache came from these old cuttings, and it produces just wonderful Grenache, which we'd be happy to compare to anywhere in the world.
How do the two terroirs that create the Beast and the Beauty, how do they contrast? What are some of the biggest differences between these two terroirs?
Yeah. Now, the best way to explain the difference between the terroir, the Beauty, and the Beast, I like to start with the Beast. And the Beast is halfway up a reasonable size hill. This hill ends up being about 1,000 feet above sea level, so roughly at about 500 feet above sea level we have the Beast block, and the Beast has only about a foot of topsoil, red-brown earth, friable red-brown earth over limestone. And so limestone is the vine roots can penetrate it, but the behaviour of those roots is that they're a bit restrained. And so what happens is the Beast then struggles for moisture. The limestone, some of these, it acts like blotting paper. You can pour water on it and absorbs very quickly and it goes away. But you try and get the water out again, it's quite difficult. So the vines can get it, but it's just really slow release. So the Beast vines are always under a reasonable amount of stress. Not too much that they fall over, but just enough. And I think some of the best wines in the world are when the vines are under some level of stress. And so by being under stress, the Beast then produces small berries. Of course, the circumference area to the pulp, the ratio of that is very high, and all the flavours in the skins. So you get this really concentrated, massive flavours coming out of the Beast, purely from that restraint, from restraint of access to soil moisture. Vines are smaller, the canopy's smaller, you get more sunlight, a bit more ripeness, so you end up getting riper berries, higher flavour concentration. Something happens though with the flavour profile that it gets those tannins. There are an enormous amount of tannin in the wine, but it's soft, grippy tannin, and it's very approachable. And so the wine, even though it's very rich, it doesn't feel too heavy on your palate. So it's got some level of brightness in this quite big, rich, and intense wine. When on hot summer's evenings, it gets a slight cooling effect from breezes coming up from a hill on its western side, but it doesn't sit in the cool air pocket. So it's hotter overnight than further down the hill. And that's probably a good time to introduce what happens further down the hill. So you imagine right by the creek, we have this creek that runs through called Granite Creek. You can imagine right by the creek the soils are deeper, and so the roots have got more capacity to go further into the soil. So instead of being restricted by feet, these are going many feet down. The Beauty block has some limestone, bluestone, shale involved, so slightly different. And I think that provides a little bit of slight nuanced difference in wine style. We've adapted the vineyard because of the extra vigour by being in deeper soils. We put a second cordon, so you've got a lower cordon and an upper cordon, and that's to try and just reduce some of the vigour. Fundamentally, it's two vineyards in one, and works extremely well. But this is the same clone, the Beauty clone's the same clone as the Beast, but even though we've devigored it, it still has more vigour, still ends up being more vigorous than the Beast box, so the berries are bigger. So the concentration of flavour is still significant, but it's less. The cold air that comes up on our western hill, it settles down into this part of our property, and it's up to, I think, 10 degrees Fahrenheit or something like that, colder on some mornings and evenings than further up the hill. Yeah, so the growing conditions are substantially different. So that takes this block longer to ripen. The tannins are less, the tannins are softer, the aromatics are higher. We do play a bit of a trick where we accentuate those aromatics with Viognier. And we do, instead of using open fermenters like we do with the beets, we use open fermenters. The beauty we don't. We try and use closed fermenters. We use French oak with both the wines, so that comparison is pretty similar. A bit less though in the beauty and slightly more on the beast. But it's really more so about really the growing conditions and the soil depth and the soil type, which really has the biggest influence on those two wonderful wine styles.
Awesome. Okay, that really explains it. How do these two wines, the Beauty and the Beast, capture, explain, present the essence of Hentley Farms?
One of the exciting things about the Beauty and the Beast is they really tell a strong story about what Hentley Farm is, what it represents. And for me, it shows you that we really go into detail about terroir, and we let the terroir tell its story through its wine. So the fact that the beast is in the gnarlier soils and produces this bigger, richer wine of that tannin that is huge tannins but very approachable. It tells its story, and then when you go to the beauty, that it tells this, it shows you this elegance wine, this aromatic wine, this wine that you wouldn't necessarily expect from the Barossa because of its sheer beauty and its elegance. It tells you that we're prepared to and love to exploit the terroir, and we go further around the property and do the same. So we're really expressing the natural environment through the vine, through the grapes, and through the vine.
What is the food experience you recommend for the Beast, and what is the food experience you recommend for the Beauty?
Most importantly, we are really enthusiastic about how our wines pair with food. And you can expect there's different food pairings for the Beauty versus the Beast. What I have seen over the many years, which pairs perfectly with the Beast, is a very rich red meat, probably going down a T-bone or a ribeye or something either, you know. We love lamb here in Australia, but certainly beef is either beef or lamb is a classic Beast pairing. Make sure you get the sauce, which is quite fitting, which is going to be quite rich and probably chocolatey, or be ideal. And when it comes to the beauty is a little bit more universal. Yes, it can pair with the stronger red meats, but it can also pair well with some more gamey kind of meats, like maybe some duck, some pigeon, even white meats like chicken. It can handle some meats which are more delicate.
So if you were a vegetarian, what would you pair?
Now, of course, if you're a vegetarian, I would tend to go something which has got a reasonable amount of rich flavours, and so some of that might be the trick might be to play in what kind of dew or sauce you then add to the dish, just to bring in some meld the two together. So it can match with any vegetable. More so, I'm trying to think. Eggplant, for example, would be something that I would go to off the top of my head. But once again, bring in a sauce that can just bring the two together, and you'll be fine.
What makes Hentley Farm unique?
Yeah, what's unique about Hentley Farm? I think our fascination with one primary estate makes us unique, and the fact we've then turned over almost every stone to try and understand the different terroirs, and we've been prepared to make very tiny batches of wine from the one estate and see what they deliver, but also experiment with different techniques amongst those small blocks and rows. We go down to almost to the vine. That's not so common. Most wineries would have various estates, and it was quite significantly different locations in the Barossa, and some would have a much bigger reliance on their growers for their more premium wines.
Very good.
Yeah.
I do have one last question is, what is behind Hentley Farm name?
The Hentley Farm name, when I started with my wife in '97, interesting, we purchased Hentley Farm 1 month before we got married. And so we had some level of confidence that we were going to be together for some time. Of course, I could have called our winery Hentschke with a T, and legitimately could have done that, but I think that would have been, I think the trade would have said that's not really a nice way to play the game. So we had this sort of dilemma, what are we going to call it? And I'd employed a chap to come up with a name. We paid him quite a bit of money. And my wife and I, we didn't like his names at all. And so we threw them away and decided to put the first half of my surname together, Hint, and she was a Saw Lee. And so we just added the Lee to Hent and said, well, that sounds good. To people who know me as a Hentschke, they can remember that, and away we went.
Wow, this is not well known.
No, not as well known as you think. You think that everyone would know, but no. No, people now go, oh, well, and why'd you call it a farm? Because it was a mixed farm at the time, and so it just sort of made sense.
I can really relate to hiring a consultant for naming. We went through that the same thing. It was like,
Yeah.
and then all of a sudden, maybe you needed that process to really kind of push
Yeah.
yourself to the next level.
And one of the guys came up with a winery called Salt Creek, and I said, no, salty Salt. I said, no, no. And he did say, though, what I did take behind, he said, whatever you come up with, generally speaking, it doesn't matter as much as you think, is because you'll create the meaning of the name. I said, oh, yeah, fair enough. Well, let's just create a name that we can then mould.
Very
That
cool.
actually was, that's really good. Yeah, that's very smart. Great.